By the summer of 1821, the Bell Witch's grip on the Bell family finally loosened. The family, weary and broken, left the farm for good. The house, once their home, was abandoned. The Bell Witch had won, but it had also left its mark on the Bell family and the town of Adams forever. Though the haunting had subsided, the legend of the Bell Witch did not fade. Stories of strange occurrences continued to circulate, and some locals claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a woman walking through the woods near the Bell farm. Over time, the story of the Bell Witch became a cornerstone of American folklore, inspiring books, movies, and countless retellings. The question of whether the Bell Witch was a poltergeist, a vengeful spirit, or something far darker was never fully answered. In the years that followed, the Bell family moved away from the area, and the farm was eventually abandoned. However, the Bell Witch's legacy lived on. Tourists and ghost hunters still visit the site of the old Bell farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious forces that once terrorized the Bell family. Some say they still hear the whispering voice of the witch in the wind, while others claim to see strange lights flickering in the woods at night. As for the Bell family, their names became synonymous with the supernatural, and their haunting story remains one of the most chilling in American history. The Bell Witch is remembered as a relentless, mysterious force that forever altered the lives of those who crossed its path. The questions surrounding the haunting, what it was, why it happened, and whether it will ever truly be gone remain unanswered, leaving the legend of the Bell Witch to haunt the minds of those who dare to explore its dark history. The Bell Witch's curse may have claimed John Bell's life, but the haunting has never truly ended. The story lives on, echoing through the ages, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that still lurk in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. The Bell Witch will forever remain a part of Tennessee's history, a dark chapter that continues to fascinate and terrify all who hear its tale. In the years just after the First World War, the city of New Orleans was a place unlike any other in America. It was a city of deep shadows and dazzling light, of old-world superstition and modern, vibrant music. It was the birthplace of jazz, a place where the air itself seemed to thrum with life. But, beginning in 1918, a new, terrifying sound began to cut through the music. It was the sound of splintering wood in the dead of night, as a phantom killer chiseled his way into the homes of sleeping families. He would ignore their money and their jewelry, and instead, he would pick up their own axe and use it to commit acts of unspeakable violence. This killer, who became known as the Axeman, was never caught. He was a ghost who terrorized a city, and then, after sending one of the most bizarre letters in the history of crime, a letter in which he claimed to be a demon from hell and made a strange promise involving jazz music, he vanished, leaving behind a legend that is forever woven into the dark musical soul of New Orleans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. To truly understand this story, you have to imagine New Orleans in the early 20th century. This was a city that lived by its own rules. A bustling, humid port city on the Mississippi River, it was a melting pot of cultures. French, Spanish, African, Creole, and a large growing community of Italian immigrants, mostly from Sicily. It was a place of deep Catholic faith, but also a place where the traditions of voodoo were practiced openly in the city's shadowy back alleys. It was a city of contradictions, where gaslit cobblestone streets met the electric glow of raucous dance halls from which a new revolutionary sound called jazz music spilled out into the night. It was into this vibrant, chaotic, and superstitious world that the Axeman came. Our story begins on the morning of May 23rd, 1918. Two brothers, Jake and Andrew Maggio, walked to the small grocery store and saloon they owned with their other brother, Joseph, and his wife, Catherine. The store was located on the ground floor of a two-story building, with Joseph and Catherine's apartment directly above. When they arrived, they found the front door was locked, which was unusual. After getting no answer, they went around to the back and found a disturbing sight. The bottom panel of the back door had been chiseled out, creating a crude opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. A deep sense of dread washed over them. They managed to get inside and called out for their brother and his wife, but were met with a dead, oppressive silence. They climbed the stairs to the apartment, and the first thing they saw was their sister-in-law, Catherine, lying in a heap on the floor. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. In a state of shock and horror, they stumbled into the bedroom. There, they found their brother, Joseph, lying in his bed, his head and face having been brutally crushed by a massive, powerful blow. The sheets were soaked in blood. The police were called, and the scene they found was one of both savage violence and strange, meticulous detail. In the bathroom, they found a bloody axe, the kind used for splitting wood, which belonged to the Maggios themselves. It had been left in the bathtub as if to wash away the evidence. On the floor of the bedroom, they found a straight razor, which they determined had been used to cut Catherine's throat. Bizarrely, the razor belonged to Joseph's brother, Andrew, who worked as a barber and had left it at the apartment a few days earlier to have Joseph sharpen it for him. The killer had found it and used it, but the most confusing part of the crime scene was that nothing of value had been taken. Money was left in the cash register downstairs. Jewelry in the apartment was untouched. This was not a robbery. This was something else. This was a crime of pure, unadulterated rage. The police investigation was chaotic from the start. They initially suspected Andrew Maggio, the owner of the razor, but he had a solid alibi. They had no witnesses and no fingerprints. The only real clue was a cryptic message found faintly chalked on the sidewalk a few doors down. It read, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." This was a reference to a previous unsolved murder of a man named Tony Sciambra, but the police couldn't make a definitive link. The case went cold, a brutal but seemingly isolated incident. But then, 1 month later, the Axeman struck again. On June 27th, a baker named John Zanka was making his morning deliveries when he noticed that the back door of the grocery store, owned by a man named Louis Basumer, had its lower panel chiseled out. It was the exact same method of entry as the Maggio murder. Zanka alerted the police, who entered the apartment to find a gruesome scene. Louis Basumer and his mistress, a woman named Harriet Lowe, were in their bed, both having suffered horrific head injuries from a hatchet that, once again, belonged to the victims and had been left at the scene. Miraculously, both Basumer and Lowe were still alive. They were rushed to the hospital. As police investigated, they once again found that no money had been taken. This was not a robbery. This was a pattern. A serial killer was at large in New Orleans. A killer who seemed to specifically target Italian grocers, who used a chisel to silently enter their homes, and who used their own axes to attack them as they slept. The case took a bizarre turn at the hospital. Harriet Lowe, before lapsing into a coma, reportedly told police that she thought the attacker was a young, dark-skinned man, but her description was vague. A few days later, she changed her story completely and accused Louis Basumer, the man lying injured in the bed next to her, of being a German spy and of having attacked her. The police, desperate for a suspect, arrested Basumer. But Lowe's story kept changing, and with no other evidence, Basumer was eventually released. Harriet Lowe died a few days later, and the truth of what she saw died with her. The city of New Orleans was now gripped by fear. The Italian-American community in particular was terrified. They were being targeted, but they didn't know why. Many of them were recent immigrants who were already distrustful of the police, and they began to take matters into their own hands, arming themselves and forming vigilante groups to patrol their neighborhoods at night. The Axeman, however, remained silent for the rest of the summer. The city began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, hoping the nightmare was over. It wasn't. On March 10th, 1919, the killer returned with a vengeance, committing his most brutal and heartbreaking crime yet. The target was another Italian grocer, a man named Charlie Cortimiglia, who lived with his wife Rosie and their beautiful 2-year-old daughter Mary. That morning, their next-door neighbor heard screams coming from the Cortimiglia apartment. He rushed over to find a scene of unimaginable horror. Rosie was standing in the doorway, her head covered in blood, holding the lifeless body of her daughter Mary. Inside, on the bed, lay her husband, Charlie, also severely injured. The little girl, Mary, had been killed by a single, powerful blow to the head as she slept in her mother's arms. Charlie and Rosie were rushed to the hospital, where they eventually recovered. Once again, the killer had used the victim's own axe and had entered by chiseling out the back door panel. The murder of a 2-year-old child sent a wave of pure terror through New Orleans. This was no longer just a killer, this was a monster. The entire city was on edge, locking their doors, sleeping with guns by their bedsides. The police were powerless, the public was terrified, and the Axeman was in complete control. And it was at this moment of peak terror that the killer decided to speak. On March 13th, 1919, a letter arrived at the office of the Times New Orleans Times-Picayune Times newspaper. The letter was bold, arrogant, and utterly terrifying. It was, allegedly, from the Axeman himself. And it was one of the strangest and most theatrical letters a serial killer has ever written. It began, "Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman." The letter continued in this bizarre supernatural tone. The author claimed to be a close relative of the Angel of Death and bragged about his power over the city. But the most famous part of the letter was the strange and specific promise he made. He wrote, "Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If you have a jazz band going, well, then it is your good fortune, but if you haven't got a jazz band and you are alone on Tuesday night, then you will get the axe." The letter was published in the paper, and the city went wild. No one knew if it was a genuine letter from the killer or a sick prank. But in a city steeped in superstition and fear, no one was willing to take the chance. And so, the night of Tuesday, March 19th, 1919, became a legendary night in the history of New Orleans. It was the night the entire city threw a party to save their own lives. Every dance hall, every saloon, every restaurant was packed to the rafters. Professional jazz bands played until their fingers were sore. But it wasn't just the public venues. In private homes all across the city, people threw Axeman parties. Families who owned a gramophone played their jazz records as loud as they could, opening their windows so the sound would spill out into the street. Those who didn't have a record player played pianos, banged on pots and pans, anything to make a joyful, jazzy noise. The entire city, from the wealthiest mansions to the poorest shacks, was alive with the sound of music. A citywide musical exorcism designed to keep the demon at bay. And it worked. On that night, the city of New Orleans held its breath and the music played on. And the Axeman, true to his word, did not strike. The Axeman would kill one more time in October of 1919. But after that, the attacks simply stopped. As mysteriously as he had appeared, the Axeman vanished. He was never identified, never caught. For decades, theories have swirled. Was he a lone sadistic madman with a grudge against Italian immigrants? Was it a series of mafia hits disguised to look like the work of a single serial killer? Or was he, as his letter claimed, something not quite human? We will never know. The Axeman of New Orleans remains a phantom, a boogeyman whose legend is forever intertwined with the city he terrorized. A city that, for one strange and unforgettable night, fought back against a demon with the only weapon he seemed to fear, a loud, defiant, and joyful noise. In the history of crime, there are few stories as audacious and as perfectly cinematic as this one. It's the story of a man who, on the eve of a major holiday, walked onto an airplane dressed in a business suit, ordered a drink, and then quietly carried out the most daring act of air piracy in American history. He wasn't violent, he wasn't loud, He was calm, polite, and completely in control. He demanded a fortune in cash and 4 parachutes, and then, in the middle of a raging storm, he did the unthinkable. He opened the rear door of the commercial airliner at 10,000 feet and leaped out into the black, freezing wilderness below, vanishing without a trace. He became a ghost, a legend, and an American folk hero. This is the story of D.B. Cooper. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our story begins on Wednesday, November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. The airports were bustling with people heading home for the holiday. Air travel in 1971 was a vastly different experience than it is today. Security was minimal, there were no metal detectors, no baggage scans. You could walk up to a counter, pay in cash, and walk right onto a plane. And that is exactly what a man did that afternoon at Portland International Airport in Oregon. He approached the ticket counter for Northwest Orient Airlines and bought a one-way ticket for the short 30-minute flight to Seattle, Washington. He was in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, and was dressed conservatively in a dark business suit, a crisp white-collared shirt, and a narrow black tie, held in place with a mother-of-pearl tie tack. He paid for his ticket in cash and gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was assigned to seat 18C. He was, by all accounts, completely and utterly unremarkable. He boarded the plane, a Boeing 727, and took his seat. The flight was only about a third full, carrying 36 passengers and a crew of 6. As the plane taxied for takeoff, he did what any businessman on a flight would do. He calmly lit a cigarette and ordered a bourbon and soda. The flight attendant who served him, a 23-year-old woman named Florence Schaffner, would later describe him as quiet, polite, and rather nice. The plane took off from Portland at 2:50 p.m., climbing into the gray, overcast skies of the Pacific Northwest. Everything was perfectly routine. A few minutes into the flight, as the plane ascended towards its cruising altitude, Cooper made his move. He caught Florence Schaffner's eye and beckoned her over. As she leaned in, he handed her a folded piece of paper. In that era, it wasn't uncommon for businessmen to flirt with flight attendants, often by passing them a note with their phone number on it. Florence, assuming this was the case, simply smiled and slipped the note unread into her purse. Cooper leaned closer. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice calm and without a hint of aggression, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence was taken aback. She opened her purse and unfolded the note. The message, written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen, was clear and direct. It said that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and that he wanted her to sit next to him. Stunned, Florence did as she was told, taking the empty seat beside him. She asked to see the bomb. Cooper calmly unlatched his black attaché case, opened it just enough for her to see inside, and then closed it again. In that brief moment, she saw what looked like 8 red sticks, which she assumed were dynamite, a large battery, and a tangle of wires. The threat was real. Cooper then stated his demands, all of which he wanted her to write down and take to the captain. His demands were incredibly specific, suggesting he was not an amateur. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked, non-sequential $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary, main parachutes, and 2 reserve parachutes. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane upon their arrival. He then calmly closed his briefcase and put on a pair of dark sunglasses. Florence took the note to the cockpit and informed the captain, William Scott. The captain immediately contacted Seattle-Tacoma Airport Air Traffic Control, who in turn alerted the local police and the FBI. The president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nyrup, made the decision to cooperate fully. The passengers' lives were worth more than the money. For the next 2 hours, as the Boeing 727 circled Puget Sound, the passengers had no idea what was happening. To them, it was just a minor mechanical delay. The flight attendants, maintaining a professional calm, told them they would be landing in Seattle shortly. But in the back of the plane, in seat 18C, Dan Cooper sat, calmly smoking cigarettes and sipping his bourbon, holding an entire airplane hostage. At 5:24 p.m., the plane was finally cleared to land at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. It touched down at 5:39 p.m. and taxied to a remote, isolated section of the tarmac away from the main terminals. The airport was bathed in the cold, driving rain of a Pacific Northwest evening. The scene was incredibly tense. The FBI and local police had surrounded the area, but Cooper had warned them that he would detonate the bomb if he saw any unauthorized approach. On board the plane, Cooper ordered all the window shades to be closed to prevent police snipers from getting a clear view. The airline had managed to scramble together the money, 10,000 individual $20 bills, and the parachutes, which they sourced from a local skydiving school. An airline employee, clad only in a t-shirt to show he was unarmed, walked out onto the rainy tarmac and delivered the cash-filled knapsack and the parachutes to the plane via the aft air stairs, the staircase at the very back of the 727. Once Cooper had confirmed the delivery, he made good on his word. He calmly allowed all 36 passengers, along with the flight attendant Florence Schaffner and another senior flight attendant, to deplane. He was now alone on the plane with Captain Scott, the first officer, the flight engineer, and one remaining flight attendant, a young woman named Tina Mucklow, who had volunteered to stay behind. Now that he had the money and the parachutes, the authorities assumed he would surrender or try to escape on the ground. But Dan Cooper had a second act planned. He informed the cockpit crew of his new flight plan. He wanted them to take off again and fly to Mexico City. But he gave them a very specific and very strange set of instructions on how to fly the plane. He demanded that they fly at an altitude below 10,000 feet. He wanted the wing flaps to be locked at a 15-degree angle, and he wanted the landing gear to remain down. And, most crucially, he demanded that the cabin remain unpressurized. To the average person, these instructions would sound bizarre. But to the flight crew and the FBI agents listening in, the plan was instantly, chillingly clear. Every single one of these instructions was designed to make the plane fly as slow and as low as possible and to keep the cabin at a breathable pressure. They were the perfect conditions for a high-altitude parachute jump. And the Boeing 727, the plane he had specifically chosen, was the only commercial airliner at the time that had a staircase at the back, the aft air stairs, that could be opened from the inside while the plane was in flight. This was not a random plan. This was the work of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. At 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 took off from Seattle and headed south into the dark, stormy night. Two F-106 fighter jets from a nearby Air Force base were scrambled to follow the airliner, but they were ordered to keep their distance to avoid spooking Cooper. In the poor visibility and thick cloud cover, they never even managed to get a visual on the 727. On board the plane, Cooper calmly instructed Tina Mucklow, the remaining flight attendant, on how to operate the aft air stairs. He then told her to go into the cockpit, close the curtain, and not come out. That was the last time anyone ever saw Dan Cooper. The flight crew, now sealed in the cockpit, could only fly the plane and wait. At approximately 8 p.m., a warning light flashed on in the cockpit, indicating that the aft air stair had been opened. The pressure in the cabin fluctuated. Then, at 8:13 p.m., as the plane flew through a violent thunderstorm over the dense, rugged wilderness of southwestern Washington, the tail section of the aircraft was suddenly jolted by a subtle upward movement. The crew knew what it meant. Dan Cooper had jumped. With $200,000 strapped to his body, he had leaped from the back of a commercial airliner into a freezing, pitch-black, and stormy night, and vanished into American folklore. The FBI immediately launched one of the largest, most expensive, and longest-running investigations in its history, codenamed NORJAC, for Northwest hijacking. The first challenge was figuring out exactly where he had jumped. Based on the flight path and the moment the tail section jolted, they were able to narrow it down to a remote, heavily forested, mountainous area on the border of Washington and Oregon. They sent in hundreds of soldiers to conduct a massive ground search, but the terrain was some of the most unforgiving in the country. It was a dense, tangled wilderness, and the search turned up absolutely nothing. No parachute, no briefcase, no money, and no body. The only physical evidence they had was what Cooper had left behind on the plane. They found his black clip-on tie, his mother-of-pearl tie tack, and 8 Raleigh cigarette butts. For decades, these items yielded few clues. But in the 2000s, forensic investigators were able to isolate a partial DNA profile from the tie. The problem was, with no body and no identified suspect, they had nothing to compare it to. For 9 long years, the case was completely cold. It seemed the mystery of D.B. Cooper, a name, by the way, that was the result of a media miscommunication, but it stuck, would never be solved. And then, in February of 1980, a small miracle occurred. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family vacation digging a fire pit on a sandy beach along the Columbia River, a spot called Tennebar. About 5 inches down in the sand, his fingers hit something. It was 3 rotting bundles of cash. When his family took the money to the police, the FBI confirmed the impossible. The serial numbers on the $20 bills were a perfect match for the Cooper ransom money. They had found nearly $6,000 of it. The discovery should have been a massive breakthrough, but instead, it only deepened the mystery. Tennebar was miles away from the primary jump zone that the FBI had calculated. How did the money get there? Scientists analyzed the diatoms on the bills and determined that the money had not been buried, but had washed ashore. This led to a theory that Cooper had landed in the Columbia River, or one of its tributaries, and drowned, and that the money had been washed downstream over the years. But if that was the case, where was the rest of the money? And where was Cooper? Over the years, the FBI investigated over 800 suspects. The list included experienced paratroopers, career criminals, and even a woman who claimed Cooper was her husband who had confessed on his deathbed. But the most compelling suspect was a man named Richard McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran and skydiving enthusiast who, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, pulled off a nearly identical crime. He hijacked a plane, demanded $500,000 and 4 parachutes, and jumped out over Utah. He was caught 2 days later. While the similarities were striking, the FBI eventually ruled him out. His physical description didn't quite match, and he had a solid alibi for the night of the Cooper hijacking. In July of 2016, after 45 years of dead ends, the FBI officially closed the active investigation into the D.B. Cooper case. It remains the only unsolved act of air piracy in American history. The central question has always been, did he survive the jump? The FBI has long maintained that he almost certainly died. He jumped at night into a thunderstorm with winds over 200 miles per hour into freezing temperatures. He was wearing a business suit and loafers. The terrain below was a dense mountainous forest. The odds of survival were almost zero. But that conclusion has never satisfied the public. The story of D.B. Cooper is the story of an ordinary man who pulled off an extraordinary crime with a cool, calm, and almost gentlemanly demeanor. He became a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion against the system. People wanted to believe he was out there, somewhere, enjoying his fortune on a beach in Mexico. The truth is, we will never know. Dan Cooper, whoever he was, stepped out of that airplane and into thin air, leaving behind an empty seat, a baffling trail of clues, and one of the most perfect, strange, and mysterious legends in the annals of American crime. There are certain fundamental laws of nature that we take for granted. Fire, for example, is a predictable force. It needs fuel, it needs oxygen, and it needs a source of ignition. When it burns, it spreads. It consumes what's around it, leaving a wide path of destruction. But what if there was another kind of fire? A fire that breaks all the rules we think we know. A fire that can erupt from within a human body, burning it to a pile of fine ash at temperatures hotter than a professional crematorium, yet leave a stack of newspapers on a table right next to the victim, completely untouched. For centuries, stories have been told of this phenomenon, dismissed as folklore or superstition. But the photographic evidence and the baffled testimonies of seasoned fire investigators and forensic experts tell a different story. They tell a story of a terrifying, logic-defying mystery, the story of spontaneous human combustion. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our first and perhaps most iconic case takes us to a sunny retirement community in St. Petersburg, Florida. The year was 1951. In a small, unassuming apartment lived a 7-year-old widow named Mary Reeser. Mary was, by all accounts, an ordinary woman. She was a bit overweight, but in decent health. She lived a quiet life, mostly keeping to herself. On the evening of July 1st, she had a visit from her son Richard, who stopped by for a short while. He left at around 9 p.m., and he would be the last person to see his mother alive. He said she was in good spirits, sitting in her favorite overstuffed armchair, wearing a rayon nightgown and a pair of black satin slippers. She mentioned she was planning to take 2 Seconal sleeping pills, as she often did, and then go to bed. The next morning, at around 8 a.m., Mary Reeser's landlady, a woman named Pansy Carpenter, came to deliver a telegram. She knocked on Mary's door, but there was no answer. She tried the doorknob and found it was hot to the touch. A wave of fear washed over her. Thinking there had been a small fire, she ran to get help from some construction workers nearby. 2 of the workers came back with her, and when they forced the door open, they were met with a scene that was so bizarre, so completely impossible, that it would go on to baffle investigators for decades. There was no major fire, the apartment was not a burned-out wreck. In fact, most of the room was completely untouched. But there was a thick, greasy black soot covering the upper part of the walls and the ceiling, and the air was thick with a strange, sweet, smoky smell. Their eyes were drawn to the corner of the room where Mary's favorite armchair used to be. The large, overstuffed chair was almost completely gone. All that remained was a pile of blackened coil springs, and in the center of those springs, in a small circle of scorched carpet, was a pile of fine gray ash. Mixed in with the ash were a few calcified fragments of her vertebrae and a human skull, which was described as being shrunken to the size of a teacup. And then there was the most famous and unsettling detail of all. Sticking out of the pile of ash, completely unharmed, was a single, undamaged human foot, still wearing its black satin slipper. Of the roughly 170-pound Mary Reeser, all that was left was a pile of ash, a few bone fragments, and her left foot. The police and fire departments were called to the scene, and they were utterly stumped. The lead investigator, Detective Cass Burgess, walked into the room and was met with a series of contradictions that defied all the laws of fire science. To reduce a human body to that state of cremation requires temperatures of around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for several hours. That is the temperature inside of a commercial crematorium. If a fire that hot had raged in that corner of the apartment, the entire room, if not the entire building, should have been a burned-out husk. But it wasn't. Just a few feet away from the pile of ash, a stack of newspapers sitting on a table was completely untouched. The plastic light switches on the wall had not melted. The paint on the lower part of the walls wasn't even blistered. The only evidence of a fire, other than the incinerated remains of Mary, was the greasy soot and a small circle of scorched carpet. There was no chemical accelerant found, no sign of faulty wiring, there was no logical source of ignition. It was as if an incredibly intense, localized fire had erupted in the very spot where Mary was sitting, consumed her almost completely, and then simply extinguished itself. The case became so bizarre that the local police sent a box of the evidence, including the ash and bone fragments, to the FBI for analysis. They even brought in a physical anthropologist and fire expert named Dr. Wilton Krogman. After examining the scene and the evidence, Dr. Krogman was completely baffled. He would later be quoted as saying, "I have never seen a case like it. I find it hard to believe that a human body, once ignited, will literally consume itself. I cannot conceive of such complete cremation without more burning of the apartment itself." He famously concluded, "This is the most unusual thing I've ever seen. As I review it, the short hairs on my neck bristle with vague fear. Were I living in the Middle Ages, I'd mutter something about black magic." Mary Reeser's death became the quintessential example of what is now known as spontaneous human combustion, and her case is far from the only one. Let's travel forward in time to December 5th, 1966, to the small town of Coudersport, Pennsylvania. A meter reader named Don Gosnell was making his rounds on a cold winter day. He arrived at the home of a 92-year-old retired physician named Dr. John Irving Bentley. Gosnell made his way down the basement stairs to read the meter, and he noticed a strange light blue smoke hanging in the air and a sweet, cloying odor, almost like incense. He thought it was odd, but he read the meter and went on his way. But when he came back up, he realized something was wrong. He called out for Dr. Bentley, but got no response. Fearing the old man might have had a medical emergency, he broke a pane of glass on the basement door and let himself in. He followed the strange smell up to the second-floor bathroom, and the scene he found there was just as impossible as the one that had greeted investigators in Mary Reeser's apartment. In the floor of the bathroom was a perfectly circular hole about 2.5 feet in diameter, burned through the linoleum and the thick wooden floorboards below. In the basement, directly beneath, there was a pile of fine ash. And standing next to the hole, as if it had simply been left behind, was the lower half of a man's right leg, from the knee down, completely intact, with its slippers still on. Of the rest of Dr. Bentley, there was nothing. His walker was found lying across the hole in the bathtub, but the rest of his body had been consumed by an intense, localized fire and had fallen through the floor into the basement below. Once again, the surrounding area was almost completely untouched by the fire. The bathtub next to the hole was fine. The paint on the walls wasn't even scorched. It was another case of a human body being reduced to ash with only a single limb remaining in a fire that seemingly had no source and caused no significant damage to its surroundings. The pattern is undeniable, and it continues into more modern times. On March 26, 1986, in a small town outside of Crown Point, New York, a young man named Rick Conti went to visit his father, a 58-year-old retired firefighter named George Mott. When he entered his father's bedroom, he was met with a bizarre scene. There was no sign of a major fire, but there was a strange, greasy film on the walls and a thick, sweet smell in the air. On his father's bed, there was a pile of ash and charred bone fragments. Among the remains, he found a piece of his father's skull and a single rib bone. The rest of the man's body was simply gone. The irony of the case was profound. A man who had spent his entire life fighting fires had seemingly been consumed by one that defied all explanation. The bed sheets around the pile of ash were barely even singed. The rest of the room was pristine. So what is going on here? For centuries, these incidents were dismissed as acts of God or works of the devil, but in modern times, science has proposed a theory that, on the surface, seems to explain these bizarre events. It's called the Wick effect. The theory of the Wick effect posits that the human body can, under a very specific set of circumstances, act like an inside-out candle. In this scenario, a person's clothing acts as the wick, and their own body fat acts as the fuel or the wax. The theory suggests that an external ignition source, like a dropped cigarette or a spark from a nearby fireplace, ignites the person's clothing. This initial flame is small, but it's enough to rupture the skin and begin to melt the subcutaneous body fat. This melted fat then soaks into the clothing, the wick, and it begins to burn, but not with a large flame. Instead, it creates a small, slow-burning, smoldering fire. This slow, contained burn can last for many hours, generating intense heat in a very localized area. This intense, localized heat can eventually consume the majority of the body, including bone, leaving behind the characteristic greasy soot and pile of ash. The Wick effect elegantly explains many of the classic hallmarks of these cases. It explains why the fire is so localized and doesn't spread to the rest of the room. It explains why there is so much greasy soot, and it explains why extremities with less body fat, like the lower legs and feet, are often left behind, untouched by the flame. For many, the Wick effect is the final, rational explanation for a seemingly supernatural phenomenon. But does it really explain everything? Many investigators and researchers have pointed out significant holes in the theory. First, the temperatures required to turn human bone into fine, calcified ash are incredibly high, around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. While a smoldering wick effect fire can get hot, many argue it cannot consistently reach the temperatures needed for such complete cremation. Second, in many of the most famous cases, including Mary Reeser's, There was absolutely no plausible source of ignition found. Mary Reeser was not a smoker, there was no fireplace. The idea of a smoldering fire also doesn't seem to account for the speed at which some of these events are thought to have occurred. And that brings us to our final and perhaps most compelling case. It happened in Galway, Ireland in December of 2010. A 76-year-old man named Michael Faherty was found dead in his home. A neighbor had been alerted by a smoke alarm and had seen smoke coming from the house. When the fire department arrived, they found Michael's completely incinerated body lying on his back on the floor of his living room. The fire that had consumed him had been so intense that it had also burned the ceiling directly above him and the concrete floor directly beneath him. But the rest of the room, including furniture just feet away, was completely untouched. The Irish police launched a full investigation. They found no signs of an accelerant. They ruled out any conventional explanation for the fire. The case was turned over to the coroner, a man named Dr. Ciaran McLaughlin. After reviewing all the evidence from the scene and the full autopsy report, Dr. McLaughlin did something almost unprecedented in modern forensic history. He officially recorded the cause of death for Michael Faherty as spontaneous combustion. He stated in his official report that after a thorough investigation, he had found no other adequate explanation for the death. So where does that leave us? We are left with a phenomenon that seems to defy logic. We have a compelling scientific theory that explains many, but perhaps not all of the details. And we have hundreds of documented cases stretching back centuries that describe a terrifying and consistent pattern. A human body burning to ash with an inexplicable, intense, and localized fire. It is a mystery that pits our rational understanding of the world against a series of impossible and horrifying facts. Is it possible that under some rare and unknown set of biological circumstances, the human body can become its own funeral pyre? The science says no. But cases like that of Mary Reeser, Dr. John Bentley, and Michael Faherty suggest that sometimes reality is far stranger and far more terrifying than fiction. There's a special kind of horror that belongs to the sea. It's the horror of the vast, empty expanse, the knowledge that a person can vanish into the blue and never be seen again. And no story captures this terror quite like that of the ghost ship, a vessel found sailing perfectly on its own with no one at the helm. In 2007, off the coast of Australia, a modern high-tech yacht was discovered drifting aimlessly in the Coral Sea. When authorities boarded it, they were met with a scene of profound and unsettling mystery. The engine was running, a laptop computer was on, and a meal was set on the table as if the crew was about to sit down to eat. All the life jackets were accounted for. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of damage. The only thing missing was the boat's three-man crew. They had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a floating time capsule of their final ordinary moments and creating one of the most baffling maritime mysteries of our time. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our story is about three friends from Western Australia who were about to embark on the trip of a lifetime. The leader of the group was 56-year-old Derek Batten, known to his friends as Des. Des was the proud owner of a brand new 12-meter catamaran he had named the Caz 2. He was a retired businessman who had been passionate about sailing for years. He wasn't a world-class sailor, but he was experienced and competent, and he had spent months preparing the Caz 2 for a grand adventure. His plan was to sail the boat from the east coast of Australia all the way around the top of the continent and back home to Perth. It was a journey of thousands of miles, a dream trip he had been planning for years. To join him on this epic voyage, Des had invited his neighbors and good friends, two brothers named Peter and James Tunstead. Peter was 69 years old, and his younger brother James was 63. They were both retired and eager for an adventure. But there was one crucial detail that would become a central point in the mystery that was to follow. Unlike Des, the Tunstead brothers were not experienced sailors. They had some basic knowledge of boating, but they were essentially landlubbers, along for the ride and to help out where they could. The safety and navigation of the Times, Kaz 2 times rested almost entirely on the shoulders of its skipper, Des Batten. On Sunday, April 15th, 2007, the three men set off. They departed from a marina in Airlie Beach, a popular tourist town on the coast of Queensland. The weather was perfect, the seas were calm, and the men were in high spirits. We know this because they documented their departure on a handheld video camera. The footage they shot that morning is both heartwarming and, in retrospect, incredibly haunting. It shows the three friends smiling and laughing, giving a tour of their new boat. They film the coastline as they pull away from the marina. Des is at the helm, looking confident and happy. The brothers are seen baiting fishing lines. It's a perfect picture of hope and excitement, the beginning of a grand adventure. It is also the last time any of them would be seen alive. For the next 3 days, the Times Kaz 2 times sailed north, up the coast into the vast blue expanse of the Coral Sea. And then, on the afternoon of Wednesday, April 18th, a Coast Watch helicopter was on a routine patrol over the outer Great Barrier Reef, a remote and protected area. The pilot spotted something unusual. It was a catamaran, its sails up, drifting aimlessly in a restricted zone. The pilot tried to make radio contact with the vessel, but received no reply. He could see that the boat's sails were badly shredded, and it seemed to be in some kind of trouble. He reported the sighting, but the yacht was too far out to sea for an immediate response. It took another 2 days until Friday, April 20th, for a helicopter from Queensland's Emergency Management Service to reach the drifting yacht. A crewman was lowered onto the deck, and the world was introduced to the baffling mystery of the ghost yacht Times Kaz 2 *. The scene that greeted the first responders was one of profound and unsettling normalcy. This was not the scene of a disaster. The boat was not damaged. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of foul play. The first thing they noticed was that the boat's engine was running, and it was in neutral, meaning the boat was just idling, being pushed along by the wind and the current. On the deck, several fishing lines were found trailing in the water. One of them had a small fish still on the hook. It was as if the men had been in the middle of a relaxing afternoon of fishing and had simply stopped. The scene below deck was even stranger. The crewman made his way into the cabin and was met with a scene that looked like the men had just stepped out for a moment. On a table, a laptop computer was open and still running. The boat's GPS and radio were both on and in perfect working order. Navigation charts were laid out on the table. A meal was found, either on the table or in the galley, seemingly ready to be eaten. In the sleeping quarters, the beds were made, and clothes were neatly folded. All of the men's personal effects, their wallets, cell phones, and glasses were right where you would expect them to be. And most crucially, all of the boat's safety equipment, including the life jackets and the emergency beacon, were all properly stowed away in their lockers. The only thing missing from this picture of perfect, peaceful domesticity was the three men themselves. They had vanished. The maritime authorities towed the Kaz 2 back to port, and a massive air and sea search was launched. For 3 days, planes, helicopters, and boats scoured hundreds of square miles of the Coral Sea looking for any sign of the missing men. They found absolutely nothing. No bodies, no debris, no floating life vests. It was as if the three friends had been plucked from their boat by an invisible hand. The investigation began, and the police were faced with a complete and total mystery. They analyzed the video camera that was found on board. The footage from the morning of their departure was the last time the men were seen. The final clip on the camera, however, was recorded later that same day. It was a short, mundane clip. It showed the water off the back of the boat, then a quick shot of a fishing line trailing in the water, and then it cuts off. It offered no clues. With no bodies and no signs of a crime, investigators were left to speculate. The media had a field day, dubbing the Times Kaz 2 times a modern-day Times Mary Celeste Asterisk, the famous ghost ship found abandoned in the Atlantic in 1872. Theories ranged from the plausible to the paranormal. The first theory to be considered was, of course, foul play. Had the men been the victims of modern-day pirates? Or perhaps they had stumbled upon a smuggling operation and were murdered to silence them? This theory was quickly dismissed. There were no signs of a struggle on the boat, the cabin was not ransacked, all of the men's valuables, including cash, were left behind, and the boat itself had not been stolen. The foul play theory simply did not fit the pristine, undisturbed scene. The next theory was that the men had staged their own disappearance. Perhaps they wanted to escape their lives and start over somewhere new. This, too, was quickly ruled out. These were not men in trouble. They were retirees, looking forward to their golden years. Des Batten had a wife of over 40 years and was close with his family. There were no financial problems, no secret lives to escape from. The idea that these three men in their 50s and 60s would concoct such an elaborate and cruel hoax on their families was deemed to be almost impossible. Another popular theory was that the boat had been hit by a freak wave or had encountered a sudden, violent squall. In this scenario, all three men could have been on deck at the same time and been washed overboard by a single, massive wave. This is a plausible event in the open ocean, but again, it didn't fit the evidence. The scene below deck was too neat. A wave powerful enough to sweep three grown men from the deck would have tossed the contents of the cabin around like a washing machine. The laptop would have been on the floor, the dishes would have been smashed, and the place would have been a wreck. But it wasn't. Everything was in its place. With no other plausible explanations, the police and the coroner were left to piece together a theory based on the few clues they had and a deep understanding of what can go wrong on the open sea. The official inquest into the disappearance of the men came to a conclusion that was both mundane and tragic. They concluded that the men had died as a result of a series of unfortunate cascading accidents. The coroner laid out a step-by-step theory of what he believed had happened on that fateful day. He believed the trouble started with a simple common problem. One of the Tunstead brothers, likely James, who was the least experienced on the boat, was fishing off the back of the catamaran. His fishing lure became snagged, possibly on the boat's own rudder or on a rock or piece of coral they were passing over. Unable to free it, he put his fishing rod down and attempted to untangle the line by hand. As he leaned over the back of the boat, which was moving in a gentle swell, he lost his balance and fell into the water. His brother Peter, seeing James in the water and struggling, would have immediately rushed to his aid. But instead of throwing him a life jacket or a rope, Peter, in a moment of panic and inexperience, also jumped into the water to try and save his brother. Now, two of the three men were in the ocean, and the boat, with its engine in neutral and its sails up, was beginning to slowly but surely drift away from them, pushed by the wind and the current. The skipper, Des Batten, would have heard the commotion and rushed to the deck. He would have seen his two friends in the water, their boat drifting away from them. He was the only one left on board and the only one with any real sailing experience. He would have tried to turn the boat around to get back to them. But a catamaran of that size can be difficult to manage for a single person, especially with the sails already up. It's possible that as he tried to maneuver the boat, the mainsail, or the boom, swung across the deck unexpectedly, knocking him overboard as well. Or, in an even more tragic scenario, Des, seeing his friends struggling and the boat drifting away too quickly, made a final, desperate, and heroic decision. He may have realized he couldn't get the boat back to them in time. So, he may have grabbed a rope or simply trusted in his own ability as a swimmer and jumped into the water himself in a last-ditch effort to save his friends. In either scenario, the result is the same. All three men were now in the water, and their empty yacht was sailing away from them, moving just a little bit faster than a man can swim. They would have watched, exhausted and helpless, as their only hope of survival slowly drifted over the horizon. This chain of events theory is the official explanation for the disappearance of the crew of the Kaz 2. It's a logical and plausible scenario that accounts for the inexperience of the crew, the trailing fishing lines, and the lack of any signs of foul play. But it is important to remember that it is still just a theory. There is no proof. It is a story pieced together by investigators to try and make sense of an otherwise senseless scene. We are left with the haunting image of that boat sailing on its own, a perfectly preserved, floating ghost ship, a testament to how quickly a dream vacation can turn into an inexplicable maritime nightmare. The three men, Des, Peter, and James, were never found. their bodies and the true secret of their final moments swallowed by the vast, unforgiving sea. Imagine a criminal who doesn't want to hide in the shadows. Instead, they want the entire world to watch their every move. Now imagine this criminal isn't a person, but a ghost, a faceless group that calls itself the Monster with 21 Faces. For 18 months, this phantom entity held the entire nation of Japan hostage. They kidnapped the CEO of a billion-dollar company, poisoned candy, and put it back on store shelves for children to find. And all the while, they sent taunting, playful letters to the police and the media, turning their crime spree into a terrifying national drama. They were always one step ahead, and in the end, they simply announced they were bored of the game and vanished forever, leaving behind one of the most baffling and audacious unsolved cases in the history of crime. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our story begins in the spring of 1984 in the prosperous and orderly nation of Japan. At the head of one of the country's largest and most beloved candy companies, Ezaki Glico was its president, a 42-year-old man named Katsuhisa Ezaki. Glico was a household name, famous for iconic snacks like Pocky and Pretz. Ezaki lived a comfortable life with his wife Mariko and their 3 children in a wealthy suburb of Nishinomiya. On the evening of March 18th, he was enjoying a relaxing bath at home after a long day. He had no idea that his quiet, successful life was about to be shattered, and that he was about to become the first pawn in a bizarre and terrifying game. At around 9 p.m., 2 masked men, armed with guns and a key, quietly let themselves into his mother's house, which was right next door to his own. They tied up his 70-year-old mother and forced her to give them the key to her son's home. A few minutes later, Ezaki's wife Mariko heard a noise and came downstairs to find the 2 masked intruders in her home. They brandished their weapons and told her they wouldn't harm her or the children if she just stayed quiet. One of the men then cut the phone lines while the other went upstairs. He kicked open the bathroom door to find a shocked Katsuhisa Ezaki. They dragged him from his bath, naked and dripping, and threw him into the shower. They told him they wanted money, 1 billion yen, the equivalent of about 10 million US dollars at the time, and 10 kilograms of gold bullion. Before he could even process the demand, they hustled him out of his own home, wrapped him in a blanket, and forced him into a waiting car. The president of the Glico Candy Company had been kidnapped from his own bathroom. The next day, the kidnappers sent a ransom note to the company demanding the massive sum of money, but the kidnappers, whoever they were, had underestimated their victim. Ezaki was not a man who would sit and wait for his fate to be decided. He was being held in a small, windowless room in what he believed to be an abandoned warehouse. After 3 days in captivity, he saw his chance. He managed to loosen his restraints, and when his captors were distracted, he made a break for it. He burst out of the warehouse and ran for his life, eventually making it to a nearby road and flagging down help. He had escaped. For the police and the Glico company, it was a moment of immense relief. The crisis was over, but they were wrong. The crisis was just beginning. The kidnappers hadn't just lost their hostage, they had been publicly embarrassed, and now they wanted revenge. This is when the criminals adopted their now famous persona. A few weeks after the escape, letters began to arrive at newspaper offices and police stations across Japan. They were from the kidnappers, but they were now writing under a new name, a name taken from a famous series of Japanese detective novels by the author Edogawa Rampo. They called themselves Kaijin Nijuichi Menso, which translates to the Monster with 21 Faces. Their letters were unlike any ransom notes the police had ever seen. They were not just demanding, they were theatrical, arrogant, and filled with a strange, dark sense of humor. They were written in a folksy, sometimes childish dialect, and they were filled with insults aimed at the police and the media. One of their early letters read, "To the dumb police, are you stupid? There are so many of you, what are you doing? If you were professionals, you would have caught us. Your abilities are so bad, we will give you a hint." This was their style. They weren't just criminals, they were performers, and all of Japan was their unwilling audience. Their first public act of terror was a direct attack on the Glico company. They sent a letter to the media announcing that they had laced Glico candy products with potassium cyanide, a deadly poison, and placed them back on store shelves. The announcement caused immediate and widespread panic. Japan is a country where food safety is taken incredibly seriously, and the idea of poisoned snacks aimed at children was a national nightmare. Glico had no choice but to pull all of its products from every store in the country. The company lost over $20 million and had to lay off hundreds of workers. The monster had failed to get their ransom, so they had inflicted a different kind of pain, bringing a corporate giant to its knees. After a few months of tormenting Glico, the monster went silent. The public began to hope the nightmare was over. But then, in September, they returned, this time with a new target, another major food company called Morinaga. Their tactics were the same. They sent letters demanding money, and when the demands weren't met, they escalated to public terror. But this time, they did something even more sinister. They didn't just claim times to have poisoned the candy, they showed the world they had actually done it. They sent letters to news outlets across the country, telling them the exact stores, and in some cases, the exact locations on the shelves where they had placed the poisoned products. A frantic race would begin, with reporters and police officers rushing to the named stores, and they would find them. Boxes of Morinaga candy, just as the monster had described, but with a new, professionally printed label on them that read, in Japanese, "Danger contains toxins. You will get sick if you eat this." The monster with 21 faces. It was a brilliant and diabolical act of psychological warfare. They weren't actually trying to kill anyone. They were proving that they times could asterisk. They were showing the entire country that they had the power to place poison in the hands of any child at any time. The fear was palpable. Candy sales plummeted across the country. Stores started pulling all Morinaga products from their shelves. The monster was in complete control. They expanded their campaign, sending threatening letters to Marudai Ham and House Foods Corporation, two other massive food companies. The Japanese food industry was in a state of siege. The National Police Agency, meanwhile, was engaged in the largest and most frustrating manhunt in the country's history. They had over 1,000 investigators working the case full-time. But they were chasing a ghost. The monster was incredibly skilled at covering their tracks. The letters were typed on an old Japanese typewriter, making them untraceable. They used public payphones for their calls. But the police did have a few agonizingly close calls. On 2 separate occasions, they arranged for a money drop with the criminals. Both times, the police were outsmarted. In one instance, a police officer was instructed to board a train and look for a man carrying a white flag. He was then supposed to follow that man to the drop-off point. The officer boarded the train, but he described the scene as chaotic, with so many people that he couldn't properly identify the contact. The drop was a failure. Their best, and ultimately most frustrating, lead came in the form of a security camera video. After the monster had claimed to have poisoned candy in a grocery store, police reviewed the security tapes. On the video, they saw a man in a baseball cap and glasses placing a box of Glico chocolate on a shelf. The man was ordinary looking, with neatly combed hair and a slight build. But witnesses who had seen him in the store described his eyes as being like those of a fox. The police released a sketch of the man, who immediately became known as the Fox-Eyed Man. His face was plastered on every television screen and in every newspaper in Japan. He became the public face of the monster, but despite the nationwide manhunt, he was never identified. The crime spree continued for 18 long, terrifying months. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. In August of 1985, the monster sent their final letter to the media. The tone was, once again, bizarrely nonchalant. It read, "Japan has become hot and humid, so we decided to forget about torturing food companies. After this, we will not threaten any more companies." They mocked the police one last time for their failures, and then ended the letter with a strange, almost childish sign-off. "We are bad guys," which means we have more things to do than bully companies. It is fun to lead a bad man's life. The monster with 21 faces. And with that, they were gone. They never sent another letter. They never made another threat. The most notorious criminal entity in Japanese history had simply announced they were finished playing their game and had vanished back into the shadows from which they came. The case went cold, but the story has one final, tragic chapter. 1 year after the monster's final letter, in August of 1986, the police superintendent in charge of the investigation, a man named Yamamoto, walked into his backyard and took his own life. He left a note expressing his deep shame and sorrow for having failed to catch the monster. It was the ultimate, heartbreaking victory for the criminals. They had not only gotten away with their crimes, but they had driven the man hunting them to his death. To this day, the identity of the monster with 21 faces remains completely unknown. Were they a single, disgruntled person with a grudge against the food industry? Or were they a sophisticated criminal organization? The skill and planning involved suggest a group, but the unique, singular voice in the letters suggests a single mastermind. They terrorized a nation, caused over $1 billion in economic damages, and ran circles around the police for a year and a half, all without ever being caught. They played their game, they won, and then they simply walked away, leaving behind a strange, dark, and utterly baffling mystery. In the darkest days of the Great Depression, while America was on its knees, a city known for its industrial might found itself haunted by a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of losing a job or a home. It was something far more primal. A phantom was stalking the forgotten corners of Cleveland, a killer who didn't just take lives, he erased them. He hunted the poor and the transient, the people no one would miss, and he would dismember their bodies with the skill of a surgeon, leaving behind only their torsos to be discovered in the grim shanty towns. This monster, who became known as the Mad Butcher, challenged the most famous lawman in America, and in the end, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of terror and one of the most chilling unsolved crime sprees in the nation's history. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. To understand this story, you first have to understand the city where it took place. The Cleveland of the 1930s was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was a powerhouse of American industry, a place of soaring skyscrapers, wealthy industrialists, and civic pride. But beneath that gleaming surface was a dark underbelly, a world shaped by the crushing weight of the Great Depression. Thousands of people were out of work, living in poverty and despair, and the epicenter of this despair was a place called Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run wasn't really a neighborhood, it was more like a scar running through the heart of the city. It was a long, polluted creek bed that snaked through the industrial valley, flanked by railroad tracks and grimy factories. In the shadow of the city's progress, a massive shantytown had sprung up. Hundreds, if not thousands of people lived there in makeshift shacks built from scrap metal, cardboard, and wooden crates. It was a place for the forgotten, the unemployed, the drifters, the alcoholics, the people who had fallen through the cracks of society. It was a grim, lawless place, full of shadows and secrets. And it was here, in this forgotten world, that a monster found his hunting ground. Our story officially begins on September 23rd, 1935. Two teenage boys were walking along the edge of Kingsbury Run when they stumbled upon a horrific discovery. Lying in the weeds was the naked lower half of a man's torso. A short distance away, they found the upper half. The man's head and all of his limbs were gone. He had been expertly dismembered, and his body had been completely drained of blood. The police were called, and they were baffled. The cuts were clean and precise, suggesting the killer had medical or anatomical knowledge. The victim was eventually identified as a 8-year-old drifter named Edward Andrassy, a man with a troubled past who was known to frequent the shantytowns. Just a few weeks later, another body was discovered nearby. It was another man, whose identity was never confirmed, who had been subjected to the same gruesome ritual: beheaded, dismembered, and drained of blood. The police knew they had something terrifying on their hands, but they had no leads. The victims were from a transient population, making it nearly impossible to retrace their steps. The killer left no fingerprints, no murder weapons, and no witnesses. He was a ghost. As the body count began to rise, the city of Cleveland started to panic. But at the same time, a new figure arrived on the scene. A man who the public believed was the one person who could stop this phantom. His name was Eliot Ness. Today, Eliot Ness is a legend. He was the famous, incorruptible federal agent who led the Untouchables, the team that finally brought down the notorious gangster Al Capone in Chicago. By 1935, Ness had left federal service and had been appointed as the public safety director of Cleveland. He was a symbol of modern scientific law enforcement, and he arrived with a promise to clean up the city. He was confident, brilliant, and had a reputation for being unstoppable. But the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was unlike any enemy Ness had ever faced. Al Capone was a man. This was a specter. Ness threw everything he had at the case. He assembled a massive task force, bringing in the city's best detectives. He personally went to the crime scenes, wading through the grim landscape of Kingsbury Run, trying to find some clue, any clue, that would lead him to the killer. But the butcher was always one step ahead. In January of 1936, the killer changed his pattern. A woman named Flo Polillo, who worked as a waitress and was known to frequent the bars around Kingsbury Run, was found. Her dismembered remains had been carefully wrapped in burlap sacks and left in baskets behind a butcher shop. The city's terror deepened. This wasn't just a killer who preyed on men. Women were now targets too. Over the next 2 years, the discoveries continued, each one more horrifying than the last. The body of a man, known only as the Tattooed Man because of the distinctive tattoos covering his body, was found cut in half. Despite his unique markings, he was never identified. The killer grew bolder, more arrogant. In the summer of 1936, the torso of a young man was found in a patch of woods. But what was terrifying was that it was right behind the Cleveland Police Department's own headquarters. This wasn't just a murder, it was a taunt. The butcher was mocking Eliot Ness and the entire police force, showing them that he could kill wherever and whenever he pleased. The press had a field day. The unstoppable Eliot Ness was being outsmarted by a phantom, and the pressure on him was immense. He was the city's savior, and he was failing. By 1938, the official victim count had reached 12, though many believed the real number was higher. Ness was a desperate man. He knew the killer was using the anonymous, chaotic nature of the Kingsbury Run shantytown as his personal camouflage. He was hiding among the forgotten, preying on them, and using the desolate landscape to dispose of their remains. So, Ness made the most controversial decision of his career. If he couldn't find the monster in the labyrinth, he would burn the labyrinth to the ground. On August 18, 1938, Ness led a massive police raid on Kingsbury Run. Over 300 officers descended on the shantytowns. They rounded up and interrogated 63 men. But this was more than an investigation, it was an eviction. After the interrogations, Ness gave the order. The police, armed with torches and kerosene, set fire to the shacks. They burned the entire shantytown to the ground, displacing hundreds of homeless people in a single fiery night. Ness's justification was that he was sanitizing the killer's hunting ground, destroying his lair. It was a brutal, desperate act, and while it was heavily criticized, one fact remains undeniable. After the burning of the shantytown, the canonical murders of the Cleveland torso murderer stopped. But Ness was not satisfied. He may have stopped the killings, but he hadn't caught the killer. In his mind, however, he knew exactly who it was. His prime suspect was a man named Dr. Francis Sweeney. Dr. Sweeney was, on the surface, a brilliant and respectable man. He was a surgeon who had served in a medical unit during World War I, where he had performed countless battlefield amputations. He was a man who knew the human body intimately, but after the war, Sweeney was a broken man. He suffered from severe alcoholism and had a history of mental breakdowns. He was known to have a violent temper, and his personal and professional life had completely fallen apart. And crucially, he lived with his family in a home that was directly overlooking Kingsbury Run. Ness became obsessed with Sweeney. The The man had the surgical skill, the knowledge of anatomy, and the proximity to the crime scenes. He fit the profile perfectly. But Ness had no physical evidence to tie him to the crimes. So, he did something highly unorthodox. He secretly took Dr. Sweeney into custody and brought him to a hotel room where, for 2 weeks, Ness and another detective personally interrogated him. Ness was convinced he was the butcher. Sweeney even allegedly failed 2 early polygraph tests. But a polygraph wasn't admissible in court, and Sweeney never confessed. Without a confession and without any hard evidence, Ness knew he couldn't charge him. Sweeney was a well-connected man from a prominent family, and a failed prosecution would have destroyed Ness's career. Frustrated, Ness had to let him go. But Sweeney knew that Ness would never give up. Shortly after the interrogation, Dr. Francis Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a mental institution. By declaring himself mentally insane, he had legally placed himself beyond the reach of the law. He could no longer be questioned or charged. He had outmaneuvered the great Eliot Ness. Dr. Sweeney would spend the rest of his life in various institutions for veterans, but he never forgot about the lawman who was so convinced of his guilt. For years, until his death in 1964, Sweeney would taunt Eliot Ness, sending him cryptic, mocking postcards from the hospitals where he was confined. The case of the Cleveland torso murderer was never officially solved. No one was ever charged, and the true identity of the killer remains a mystery. But for Eliot Ness, the case was a personal failure that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had faced down the Chicago mob and won, but he was defeated by a single, shadowy figure who was either a brilliant, insane surgeon or someone else entirely who simply vanished back into the shadows from which he came. The story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who are never caught. And that's the end of the story. Now, we jump into another story. There's a powerful idea in our culture, the dream of owning a home, a place of your own, a sanctuary to raise a family, to make memories, to put down roots. We pour our hopes and our savings into these structures of wood and brick, but we're often not the first. Every house, especially an old one, has a history. It has layers. It has soaked up the joys, the sorrows, and the secrets of the lives lived within its walls. Most of the time, those are just quiet ghosts of memory. But this story is about a family who bought their dream home for a bargain, a foreclosed property in a quiet town. And in that house, they found a diary left by the previous owner. A diary that wasn't just a record of a life, but a set of instructions for surviving what lived inside the walls with him, and by the time they understood what they were reading, it was already too late. This is the story of the Miller family, Tom, Sarah, and their 10-year-old daughter, Chloe. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? Our story begins in the spring of 2014. The Millers were at a turning point. Tom was a contractor who had just landed a stable new job. Sarah was a freelance graphic artist who could work from anywhere. They decided it was time to leave the cramped suburbs of Boston for a quieter, slower life. They found their dream on a real estate website, a beautiful 2-story Victorian house on a few acres of land in a small rural town in Maine. The house was magnificent, with a charming wraparound porch, a turreted roof, and large, beautiful windows. It needed a lot of work, the paint was peeling, the garden was overgrown, but it had what the real estate agents call good bones. And the price was unbelievable. It was a foreclosure. The bank had repossessed it after the previous owner, an elderly man, had passed away with no heirs. For Tom and Sarah, it felt like winning the lottery. They moved in on a bright, sunny day in May. The house was even better in person, but there was a certain melancholy that clung to the place. The air inside was still and heavy with the feeling of abandonment. And they noticed the neighbors were reserved, polite, but they wouldn't make eye contact for long, and they were reluctant to talk about the previous owner, a man they only referred to as Mr. Barrow. Tom, being a contractor, was excited to get to work. He started with the master bedroom, which had some significant water damage in the closet. As he was tearing out a section of damp drywall, his crowbar hit something solid. It wasn't a stud or a pipe. Behind the wall was a small hidden cavity, and nestled inside was a small leather-bound journal. It was old, the cover worn smooth with time, but it was in perfect condition. It wasn't locked. That evening, after Chloe was asleep, Sarah, whose curiosity always outweighed her caution, sat down in the living room with a cup of tea and opened the journal. The handwriting inside was elegant, precise cursive, written in fountain pen ink. It was, as they had guessed, the diary of the previous owner, Joseph Barrow. The first dozen entries were exactly what she expected. They were dated from 5 years prior. Joseph wrote about his quiet life with his wife, Mary. He wrote about his love for the house, his passion for his garden, his daily routines. He seemed like a gentle, loving man. The only slightly odd thing was the way he wrote about the house itself. He didn't refer to it as the house or my home. He called it by a name, the foundation, and he often wrote about it as if it were a living, breathing entity. An entry from his first week read, "The foundation is settling in around us. Mary says it's drafty, but I believe it is merely breathing. It seems content to have life within its walls again." Sarah read a few entries to Tom, who just shrugged. Old guy was probably just a bit eccentric. He said, "Every old house gets a nickname." They thought nothing more of it and put the diary on their nightstand. Over the next few weeks, life was good. Tom made progress on the renovations. Chloe loved her new big yard. But Sarah kept reading the diary, and she began to notice a slow, creeping change in the tone of Joseph's writing. About a year into his entries, Joseph wrote that his wife Mary had fallen ill. It was a strange, wasting sickness that the doctors couldn't diagnose. She was always cold, always tired, and she began to refuse to leave her bedroom. And Joseph's writing about the house began to shift from affectionate to fearful. An entry read, "Mary is weaker today. The chill in her bones will not leave. I believe the foundation is the cause. It has grown jealous of my love for her. It wants me for itself. I hear it groaning in the night, a hungry sound that comes up from the cellar. I mind." This is where the story takes a turn from a sad tale of an old man's grief to something far more sinister. Joseph began to document a strange and specific set of rules. He believed they were a way to appease the house, to keep its malevolent energy at bay. The rules were bizarre. Rule 1, the cellar door must never be left open after sundown. The cold from the foundation rises at night. Rule 2, the foundation dislikes the color yellow. It is a garish, happy color that offends its quiet nature. Rule 3, all mirrors must be covered before sleep. The foundation enjoys watching, and it is not good to be seen in the dark. The list went on, a dozen rules, each one more paranoid than the last. Sarah read these passages with a growing sense of unease. She told herself it was just the tragic diary of a man losing his mind as his wife was dying. But then, small, unexplainable things started to happen in the Millers' new home. Chloe was the first to show a change. She was a happy, outgoing child, but she became quiet and withdrawn. She started spending hours in her room, whispering to someone who wasn't there. When Sarah asked who she was talking to, Chloe would reply with a smile, "Mr. Joe? He's my new friend. He lives in the walls, and he tells me the secrets of the house." Then, things that mirrored the diary began to occur. Tom and Sarah would wake up in the morning and find the cellar door, which they were certain they had locked, standing wide open, a wave of unnatural cold seeping into the kitchen. One day, Sarah bought a beautiful bouquet of yellow daffodils and put them in a vase on the dining room table. The next morning, every single flower was wilted and black, as if they had been dead for a week. The other flowers in the house were fine. Sarah, her nerves frayed, found herself subconsciously starting to follow Joseph's rules. She double-checked the cellar door lock before bed. She threw out the dead daffodils and made a mental note not to buy yellow ones again. She even started covering the mirror in their bedroom with a scarf. Tom noticed her strange new habits and grew concerned. He dismissed the occurrences as coincidences, blaming her anxiety on the stress of the move and the influence of the creepy diary. The first real tension began to grow between them. Sarah felt like she was going crazy, and Tom's skepticism made her feel utterly alone. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Sarah read to the end of the diary. The final entries were written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. Joseph wrote that his wife, Mary, had finally passed away in her sleep. He didn't blame the illness, he blamed the house. He wrote that the house had consumed her warmth and was now stronger than ever. He wrote that it wouldn't let him leave, that every time he tried to pack his bags, a sudden violent accident would happen, a falling piece of plaster, a shattered window preventing his escape. The very last entry in the diary was the most terrifying of all. It was just a few sentences, written with a shaky hand. Mary is gone, but the foundation is not satisfied. It requires a family to sustain it. It needs to be fed by the warmth of life. I cannot let it take another. If I cannot leave it, then I will join it. I will become its keeper. I will merge with its bones. My hunger will be its hunger, and I will keep the next family safe, so long as they follow the rules. Sarah dropped the diary as if it were on fire. She finally understood. Joseph Barrow hadn't just died of old age. He had done something to himself, some kind of dark ritual to merge with the house, believing he could contain the entity within it. The presence Chloe was talking to, Mr. Joe, wasn't a harmless imaginary friend. It was the twisted, hungry remnant of Joseph, now a permanent conscious part of the house itself. That very night, their nightmare truly began. Around 2 a.m., Sarah woke up to a strange noise. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from inside the wall, right next to their bed. It was the same sound Joseph had described in his diary. She woke Tom, and he heard it too. It was real. As they both sat there, frozen in fear, the scratching stopped. And then, a low, masculine voice whispered from inside the wall, clear as day. It whispered one word, hungry. They grabbed Chloe from her room and spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, terrified. The next day, Tom, his skepticism finally shattered, agreed they had to leave. They booked a hotel and started frantically packing their most important belongings. That evening, as they were about to make their last trip out to the car, they realized Chloe was missing. She wasn't in the house, she wasn't in the yard. Panic set in. Sarah's mind raced back to the diary, to Joseph's obsession with the cellar. She knew, with a certainty, that chilled her to the bone where her daughter was. They ran to the cellar door in the kitchen. It was closed. But when Tom tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as if it were sealed shut by an immense, unseen pressure. He threw his shoulder against it, but it was like hitting a wall of solid rock. And then they heard Chloe's voice from the other side of the door. But it was a strange, flat, monotone voice, devoid of all emotion. She was speaking to someone. Yes, Mr. Joe, she said calmly. I understand. A family must always live here. We have to feed the house. From all around them, from the very walls of the kitchen, a low, whispering voice echoed, the same voice they'd heard in their bedroom. It was the voice of Joseph Barrow. You cannot have her, the house whispered. She belongs to the foundation now. The house must be fed. The entire house groaned around them, a sound like a great beast waking from a slumber. Tom, in a desperate rage, threw his entire body against the cellar door again and again. In that moment of pure terror, Sarah's mind had a flash of clarity. She remembered the one thing the diary had said the house hated. The color yellow? It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a dead man's insane ramblings. But it was all she had. In the living room, among the boxes, was a can of bright canary yellow paint they had bought for Chloe's room. Keep him busy! She screamed at Tom. While Tom continued to pound on the door, drawing the house's malevolent attention, Sarah ran, grabbed the can and a paintbrush, and pried the lid open with shaking hands. She ran back to the cellar door and began to frantically slap the thick, bright yellow paint all over the wood. The reaction was immediate and violent. A low, guttural moan of what sounded like pure agony echoed through the entire structure. The whispering voice of Joseph screamed, a sound of rage and pain that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The pressure on the door vanished. Tom turned the handle and it swung open easily into the darkness below. He and Sarah scrambled down the steps and found Chloe standing at the bottom, in the center of the cold earthen floor, staring at a damp, crumbling section of the stone wall. She was dazed, as if waking from a dream. They didn't wait. They each grabbed one of her hands and fled. They ran out of the house, got in their car, and drove away without looking back, leaving all their belongings and their dream home behind them. The Miller family moved to a small, modern apartment in another state and began the slow process of healing. The house in Maine, once again, sits empty, the bank having foreclosed on it for a second time. But the story doesn't quite end there. The local police have been called to the property a few times by neighbors reporting lights turning on and off in the empty house. Teenagers, on a dare, have snuck onto the porch. They say that if you press your ear against the old walls of the house, you can still hear a man's voice whispering inside. He's still whispering his rules, preparing the house for its next family. But he's added a new one to his list, a rule he learned the hard way, whispered over and over again into the darkness: no yellow. The Foundation hates yellow. The Millers didn't destroy the entity, they just gave it a new piece of information. The trap is now smarter, it's more patient, and it's waiting for the next family to come looking for their dream home. In a remote, ice-cold valley in Norway, a place the locals call Death Valley, a hiker and his daughters stumbled upon a gruesome sight. It was the partially burned body of a woman, surrounded by a bizarre collection of objects, bottles, pills, and an umbrella, all arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic manner. When police arrived, they found that every single identifying mark had been systematically erased. The labels from her clothes were cut off, and even the fingerprints on her hands had been sanded away. For over 50 years, this woman has remained a ghost. Her case is a labyrinth of fake passports, wigs, coded messages, and Cold War intrigue. She is perhaps the most perfect unsolved mystery of the 20th century. She is the Isdal woman. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. Our story begins on Sunday, November 29th, 1970, in the mountains surrounding Bergen, Norway. A university professor was out for a hike with his two young daughters in a rugged, isolated valley known as Istalen. The valley had a dark local reputation. Its name translates to the Ice Valley, but for centuries, it had been nicknamed Dødsdalen, the Valley of Death, a place known for suicides in the medieval era and for being a treacherous spot where hikers had fallen to their deaths. It was a beautiful but deeply foreboding place. As the family made their way through the rocky terrain, they noticed a strange, acrid smell in the air. It smelled like something burning. They continued on, and as they rounded a rocky outcrop, they saw the source. There, in a small clearing, were the charred remains of a campfire. But as they got closer, the father realized with a wave of horror that it wasn't a campfire. Lying on her back amongst the rocks was the body of a woman. She was in a bizarre and unnatural pose, with her arms raised up in front of her chest, a position that coroners call the fencer's pose, which is often indicative of a body being exposed to sudden, intense heat. Her entire front torso and face were burned beyond recognition. Terrified, the man gathered his daughters and rushed back to civilization to alert the police. When the Bergen police force arrived, the scene they found was even stranger than the initial reports suggested. This was not a simple hiking accident. This was something else entirely. The woman's body was surrounded by a peculiar collection of items. There were 2 plastic bottles containing water, a half-empty bottle of Street Halvard liqueur, a packed lunch, a tube of sleeping pills, a purse, and a folded-up umbrella. But the deliberate nature of the scene was what was so chilling. Investigators noted that the objects seemed to be arranged around the body in a ceremonial fashion, and then they noticed the erasure. Every single label on the woman's clothing had been carefully cut off, the brand markings on the bottles had been peeled away. There were no identifying marks on any of her possessions. This was a person who had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure no one would ever know who she was. The police initially thought this was a suicide, a strange one, but a suicide nonetheless. But when the body was taken back to the morgue, the mystery deepened. The medical examiner discovered that the woman's fingerprints had been systematically sanded or filed off her fingertips. This was not the act of a desperate person ending their life. This was the work of someone who was an expert at erasing an identity. This was the work of a professional. With no ID, no fingerprints, and no recognizable features, the investigation was at a complete standstill. They had a ghost. Their first big break came a few days later. Police discovered two suitcases that had been left in a luggage locker at the Bergen train station. They managed to trace them back to the hotel where the mystery woman had last been staying. When they opened the suitcases, the case blew wide open, taking a sharp turn from a strange death to a full-blown international espionage thriller. Inside the suitcases, there was no identification, but there was a collection of wigs and several pairs of non-prescription glasses, clearly meant for changing one's appearance. There was a variety of different currencies: Norwegian, Belgian, British, and Swiss. There were maps, bus and train timetables, and a tube of eczema cream with the prescription label removed. And just like at the crime scene, every single piece of clothing in the suitcases had had its tags and labels meticulously cut off. But the most important discovery was a small notepad. On the first page, the police found a series of numbers and letters written in a strange code. The city's best codebreakers were put on the case, and they soon realized it was a relatively simple substitution cipher. They cracked it. But the decoded message wasn't a confession or a spy's secret. It was a dry, meticulous list of dates and locations. It was a travelogue. O25 030P, translated to October 25th to 30th Paris. N29 S2 O, translated to November 29th, Stavanger. October 2nd, Oslo. It was the travel itinerary of a ghost. Using the decoded notepad and witness statements, the police began the painstaking process of retracing the woman's steps. And they discovered that she hadn't just been a ghost in death, she had been one in life, too. They found that she had traveled all over Europe, from Paris to Geneva to Oslo, using at least 8 different completely fake passports. She had checked into hotels under a series of aliases: Fenella Lork, Claudia Telt, Vera Jarley, Alexia Zarna Merches. Each name came with a different nationality and a different backstory. Handwriting analysis of the hotel check-in cards she had filled out confirmed they were all the same person. Witness descriptions from hotel staff across Norway and Europe began to paint a picture of this enigmatic woman. She was described as elegant, well-dressed, and always solitary. She spoke German, French, Flemish, and English, all with an unidentifiable accent. She always paid in cash and often requested to change rooms multiple times during a single stay. She was a woman who was an expert at being seen, but never known. Investigators were able to piece together her final days in Bergen. She checked into the Hotel Hordeheimen, staying in room 407. She told the staff she was a traveling saleswoman and antique dealer. She would often leave her room for long periods, and when she was there, she seemed paranoid, keeping the furniture pushed up against the door. After a few days, she checked out and moved to another hotel, and then another, a classic sign of someone trying to avoid being followed. The last time anyone saw her alive, she was checking out of her hotel on the morning of November 23rd. She paid in cash, and a taxi took her to the Bergen train station, where she put her 2 suitcases into a storage locker. After that, she seems to have vanished for several days. It's believed she was seen by a local man on the day she died, November 29th. He saw a well-dressed woman, not in hiking gear, walking ahead of him on the trail leading into Isdalen Valley. She had a look of fear on her face, and he noticed 2 large, dark-haired men in coats following her at a distance. He thought it was strange, but didn't want to get involved. He didn't report it to the police until after her body had been found. The autopsy revealed that the woman had died from a combination of 2 things. She had a massive amount of phenobarbital, a powerful sleeping pill, in her stomach, at least 50 pills, and she had died from carbon monoxide poisoning from the fire. Soot was found in her lungs, which meant she was still alive and breathing as the fire burned. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide, but this conclusion has been challenged by investigators and journalists for decades. It makes almost no sense. If you were planning to take your own life with an overdose of sleeping pills, why would you also set yourself on fire? And if you were going to do that, why would you do it in such a remote, hard-to-reach location? Why would a suicidal person go to the extreme, professional-level lengths of erasing their fingerprints and cutting every label from their clothing? It just doesn't add up. This leads to the most enduring and plausible theory, that the Isdal woman was a spy. The time period, 1970, was the height of the Cold War. Norway, as a founding member of NATO sharing a border with the Soviet Union, was a hotbed of espionage. And her methods, the multiple identities, the wigs, the coded messages, the constant hotel changes, were all classic spy tradecraft. It's also been noted that around this time, Norway was conducting top-secret tests of its new Penguin missile system, a weapon that would have been of immense interest to the Soviet Union and other foreign powers. Was she a spy who was about to be captured and chose to take her own life rather than be interrogated? Or, perhaps more likely, was she a spy who had been compromised and was eliminated by her own agency or by an enemy agency? A professional hit staged to look like a bizarre suicide to create confusion and allow the killers to disappear. This would explain the two men seen following her into the valley. For 50 years, the case remained cold. But in 2016, the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation launched a massive new investigation. They were able to create a full DNA profile from a tissue sample. They sent it to law enforcement agencies all over the world. They even managed to conduct a chemical analysis of her teeth, which determined that she had likely grown up in or near Nuremberg, Germany, around the time of World War II. But despite all this new science, no match has ever been found in any database. Her identity remains a complete mystery. The Isdal woman is a perfect enigma. She was a ghost who walked out of the shadows of Cold War Europe, lived a life of complete and total secrecy, and then vanished back into those shadows in a strange and fiery death. She is a woman without a name, without a past, and without a country, leaving behind only a trail of questions that will likely never be answered. And that's the end of the story. Next story is The Bell Witch of Tennessee, a tale of haunting and mystery. Part 1. The Curse of the Bell Family. In the early 1800s, nestled in the rolling hills of Adams, Tennessee, the Bell family was living the kind of quiet, peaceful life that most settlers dreamt of. John Bell, the patriarch, had built a modest but successful farm with his wife, Lucy, and their children. They had settled into a large log cabin surrounded by vast fields, shaded groves, and thick forests. Their home was a beacon of serenity in the otherwise untamed wilderness of early America. But little did they know, this idyllic life would soon be shattered by a force far beyond their understanding. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It all started in 1817 when strange and unexplainable events began to disturb the Bell family. At first, it seemed harmless enough, just little oddities that could easily be explained away as tricks of the wind or the creaking of the old house. The first strange occurrence was subtle, almost imperceptible, faint knocking noises that seemed to come from the walls of their home. At first, John Bell assumed it was just the house settling, but the sounds grew more insistent, almost rhythmic. It was as though someone or something was knocking from inside the walls, tapping and scratching. Soon after, the noises became louder and more varied. The family began to hear rattling chains in the middle of the night, followed by strange scratching and scurrying sounds in the dark. The house, once a sanctuary of comfort, began to feel alive in the most unsettling way. The children would wake in the night, frightened, convinced that something unseen was in their room with them. Lucy Bell, who was used to the peaceful sounds of nature outside their window, now found herself lying awake in the dark, listening to the disturbing noise echoing through the house. One evening, John Bell was sitting by the fire, enjoying a quiet moment when he suddenly felt an intense and sharp pain in his throat. It felt as if someone had struck him from behind with a heavy stick. He clutched his throat, his eyes wide with surprise, but there was no visible injury. The pain came and went, but its suddenness and intensity left him shaken. He wondered if it was just a momentary ailment, but soon after, other strange things started happening to him as well. He felt weak and unable to move, as though a heavy weight was pressing down on him, sapping his strength. As the days passed, these odd occurrences became more frequent. The family would wake in the morning to find objects had been moved or displaced overnight. Chairs that had been neatly tucked under the table would be found overturned, and the household items that had once been in their proper place were now scattered about in a haphazard manner. At night, the sound of heavy footsteps pacing back and forth outside their door would keep them awake, their minds filled with dread and confusion. And always, lurking in the back of their thoughts, was the unsettling suspicion that something or someone was there with them. But the true horror began when the voice started. At first, it was a soft whisper, so faint that no one was certain it was real. The voice seemed to come from nowhere, and yet it was clearly audible. It would echo in the empty rooms, as though speaking directly to the Bell family. The voice was cold and mocking, calling their names and making strange, cryptic remarks. John Bell, who had been a man of reason and solid character, was now terrified. He tried to reason with the voice, but it mocked him, repeating the same words over and over. It wasn't long before the voice became louder, more insistent, and more threatening. The family soon learned that the voice wasn't just any ordinary spirit. It identified itself as the spirit of Kate Batts, a woman who had lived in the area and had once been involved in a bitter dispute with John Bell. According to local legend, Kate Batts had cursed John before her death, and now, from beyond the grave, she sought her revenge. She claimed that her death had been caused by John's actions, though the exact details of the curse were shrouded in mystery. It seemed that Kate Batts had returned not to haunt, but to torment. Her voice, now unmistakable, would call out to the Bells at all hours of the day and night. It was relentless, speaking not only to John and Lucy, but also to their children, taunting them, mocking their every move. The spirit made it known that it had no intentions of leaving. It was there to stay, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family could no longer ignore the malevolent force in their home. It wasn't just the strange noises or the terrifying voice, it was the sense of dread that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, and no one felt safe, even in the daylight. The family's once warm home now felt cold, its floors and walls filled with invisible eyes watching their every move. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a torment that felt personal, as though they had been chosen for this nightmare. What made the situation even more terrifying was that the Bell Witch didn't just speak to the family from a distance, it began to physically attack them. At night, John and Lucy would feel sharp, invisible forces pulling at their clothes, tugging at their hair, and slapping them across their faces. The children, especially Betsy, became the focus of the spirit's fury. Betsy, a young girl, would wake in the night, crying out in pain as her hair was violently pulled or her body was scratched and bruised by unseen hands. The Bell family, once proud and strong, was now terrorized by an invisible but very real enemy that seemed to know their every weakness. As the haunting grew more intense, the Bell family tried everything they could think of to rid themselves of the malevolent spirit. They called upon local ministers and spiritualists, hoping to find a solution, but nothing worked. The Bell Witch seemed to be one step ahead of them at every turn, its power only growing stronger. It was clear that the Bell family was in the grip of something far more sinister than any of them had ever imagined. What had started as small noises and whispers had transformed into a full-fledged nightmare. And, the worst part, it seemed there was no way out. Part 2. The haunting intensifies. As the days passed, the Bell family's life turned into a waking nightmare. The once peaceful farm in Adams, Tennessee had become the battleground of a battle they couldn't fight, a battle against something invisible yet undeniably powerful. It wasn't just the sounds anymore, it was the overwhelming presence that seemed to hang over them, thickening the air and making their every breath feel labored. The Bell Witch had made it clear, it was not going to leave. The terrifying voice that had once whispered now shouted with increasing frequency and malevolence. It mocked the family, repeating their names, ridiculing their every action. The words were more than just an annoyance, they were an attack, a mental and emotional torment that weighed heavily on the Bells. But it wasn't just the voice that haunted them, it was the unseen force that followed them every waking moment, making even the simplest task feel impossible. John Bell, the once proud patriarch, was struck with a sickness that no doctor could diagnose. His health deteriorated rapidly, and he grew weaker with each passing day. At first, his family thought it was just the stress of the haunting taking its toll, but as time went on, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. John was plagued by a strange, sensation-sharp, debilitating pains in his throat that felt like invisible hands strangling him. His body trembled, and he lost the strength to even sit up. It was as if the Bell Witch had cursed him with a slow, painful demise. In the midst of this growing terror, it was Betsy, John's young daughter, who became the focal point of the haunting's malevolent energy. The Bell Witch, seemingly fixated on her, began to physically torment her in ways that no child should ever endure. At night, Betsy would scream in agony as invisible hands clawed at her, pulling her hair and scratching her arms. Her once peaceful bedroom became a battleground, with the relentless spirit attacking her without mercy. One night, while Betsy was asleep, the Bell Witch escalated its attacks. It dragged her out of bed and threw her violently across the room as though an unseen force had picked her up and tossed her like a rag doll. The family, helpless and terrified, could only watch in horror as their daughter suffered. John and Lucy Bell, weakened and fearful, were powerless to protect their child from the unseen terror that had taken hold of their home. The ghostly torment didn't stop at physical violence. The Bell Witch began to speak directly to Betsy, taunting her with cruel words. It threatened to kill her, mockingly asking if she was afraid to die. The voice seemed to enjoy her suffering, reveling in the fear it caused. The witch seemed to delight in Betsy's pain, using her as a means of breaking the family's spirit. The situation grew worse as the Bell Witch began to attack not just Betsy, but other members of the family. John Bell, once a man of strength, found himself paralyzed, his body betraying him as the curse took hold. It wasn't just his physical health that deteriorated, it was his spirit. Each day he seemed more and more defeated, unable to fight the invisible force that tormented him. Lucy Bell, desperate to protect her family, sought out help from spiritualists, priests, and local leaders. She even consulted with local ministers, hoping that prayers and blessings could drive out the evil that had taken root in their home. But no one had any answers. The Bell Witch mocked their efforts, saying that no one could stop it. The ministers, despite their best efforts, could only leave in fear, their prayers seemingly having no effect on the malevolent spirit. The haunting reached a fever pitch when a group of local spiritualists, intrigued by the Bell family's plight, came to visit the farm. These spiritualists were well known for their work with the supernatural, and they believed that they could communicate with spirits. They arrived at the Bell farm, hoping to make contact with the entity that had been tormenting the Bells. What they didn't expect was that the Bell Witch was more than capable of revealing itself. The moment the spiritualists entered the Bell house, the witch began to make itself known with terrifying force. The voice shouted at them, demanding that they leave, mocking their feeble attempts to communicate with it. The witch spoke through the spiritualists, using their own voices to deliver cryptic, unsettling messages. The Bells and their visitors were left stunned and terrified by the experience. But the most shocking revelation came when the Bell Witch, in an eerie display of power, began to answer questions that no one could have known the answers to. It revealed secrets about the Bell family, things that only the Bells themselves could have known, details of their personal lives, private moments, and even their darkest fears. The witch's knowledge was terrifying, and its ability to manipulate the family with such precision left the Bells feeling completely helpless. As the haunting continued to intensify, the family was pushed to the brink. Desperate and fearful for their lives, the Bells made the difficult decision to leave their home. But no matter where they went, the Bell Witch followed. It was clear now. The witch had chosen them, and it wasn't going to let them go. The townspeople of Adams, hearing about the Bell family's torment, began to whisper about the Bell Witch. Some believed it was a poltergeist, others thought it was a curse, but no one could explain the full extent of the supernatural force that had overtaken the Bell family's lives. The Bell Witch became a legend in the town, and the story of the Bell family's suffering spread far beyond the borders of Tennessee. With each passing day, the Bell Witch's power grew stronger, and it became clear that the family had no escape. The torment continued day and night, wearing down their spirits. And yet, the family held on to one fragile hope, that somehow someone might find a way to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed their lives. But that hope would be tested in ways they never could have imagined. As the Bell Witch's grip tightened, the family had to ask themselves, was this a curse they could survive, or were they destined to be consumed by the malevolent force that had taken over their home? The nightmare was far from over. Part 3. The Final Confrontation and Legacy. As the haunting grew more unbearable, the Bell family's will to continue living in their own home seemed to wane. The once tight-knit family was now fractured, each member haunted by the relentless terror of the Bell Witch. The invisible force that tormented them seemed to have no end, no mercy, and no explanation. It wasn't just physical suffering anymore, it was emotional and psychological devastation, as the Bell Witch seemed determined to break their spirits in every way imaginable. The family's final attempt to confront the Bell Witch came in the fall of 1820. John Bell, though gravely ill, made one last effort to find peace for his family. He called upon a group of local spiritualists and religious leaders, hoping that together they might finally put an end to the curse. The group arrived at the Bell farm with hopeful resolve, but none of them knew the true power of the spirit they were about to face. The Bell Witch, who had already demonstrated its mastery over the physical and psychological realm, now prepared to reveal its final act of terror. As the group began to pray and perform rituals in an attempt to banish the spirit, the Bell Witch's voice erupted into the room. It mocked their efforts, taunted their prayers, and laughed at their attempts to cleanse the house. But it wasn't just words this time. The Bell Witch's presence filled the room like a tangible force, shaking the very walls of the house. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, and the temperature plummeted as though the room itself was being consumed by an icy chill. John Bell, who had been frail and weak for months, suddenly seemed to gain strength. He spoke to the group with urgency, asking them to continue the prayers. It was as if he knew that this moment would be the turning point. But just as it seemed that the Bell Witch might finally be banished, something shifted. The voice, now more furious and vengeful than ever, announced its most shocking declaration: "I have killed him." In a final, terrifying move, the Bell Witch claimed the life of John Bell. On December 20, 1820, John Bell dyed his body, weak, frail, and seemingly drained of life. The family, devastated by his death, believed that the curse had claimed him at last. His passing was swift and mysterious, and many suspected that the Bell Witch had somehow poisoned him, fulfilling its threat to take his life. John Bell's death sent shockwaves through the community. The family had suffered for years under the torment of the Bell Witch, and now, it seemed, the witch had finally claimed its prize. The news of John's death spread quickly through Tennessee, and the legend of the Bell Witch gained even more prominence. Local ministers, townsfolk, and curious onlookers flocked to the Bell farm, desperate to witness the haunting firsthand. Some believed that the witch's power was fading, while others feared that the worst was yet to come. But despite John Bell's death, the haunting did not end with his passing. The Bell Witch, now seemingly victorious, continued to torment the Bell family. However, Betsy, John's daughter, who had been the primary target of the witch's physical assaults, began to experience a change. The witch's hold on her seemed to loosen, and her attacks became less frequent. In the months following her father's death, Betsy decided to end her engagement to a local young man named Joshua Gardner, likely influenced by the Bell Witch's malevolent presence. Once this final break occurred, the torment seemed to cease entirely. By the summer of 1821, the Bell Witch's grip on the Bell family finally loosened. The family, weary and broken, left the farm for good. The house, once their home, was abandoned. The Bell Witch had won, but it had also left its mark on the Bell family and the town of Adams forever. Though the haunting had subsided, the legend of the Bell Witch did not fade. Stories of strange occurrences continued to circulate, and some locals claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a woman walking through the woods near the Bell farm. Over time, the story of the Bell Witch became a cornerstone of American folklore, inspiring books, movies, and countless retellings. The question of whether the Bell Witch was a poltergeist, a vengeful spirit, or something far darker was never fully answered. In the years that followed, the Bell family moved away from the area, and the farm was eventually abandoned. However, the Bell Witch's legacy lived on. Tourists and ghost hunters still visit the site of the old Bell farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious forces that once terrorized the Bell family. Some say they still hear the whispering voice of the witch in the wind, while others claim to see strange lights flickering in the woods at night. As for the Bell family, their names became synonymous with the supernatural, and their haunting story remains one of the most chilling in American history. The Bell Witch is remembered as a relentless, mysterious force that forever altered the lives of those who crossed its path. The questions surrounding the haunting, what it was, why it happened, and whether it will ever truly be gone remain unanswered, leaving the legend of the Bell Witch to haunt the minds of those who dare to explore its dark history. The Bell Witch's curse may have claimed John Bell's life, but the haunting has never truly ended. The story lives on, echoing through the ages, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that still lurk in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. The Bell Witch will forever remain a part of Tennessee's history, a dark chapter that continues to fascinate and terrify all who hear its tale. In the years just after the First World War, the city of New Orleans was a place unlike any other in America. It was a city of deep shadows and dazzling light, of old-world superstition and modern, vibrant music. It was the birthplace of jazz, a place where the air itself seemed to thrum with life. But beginning in 1918, a new, terrifying sound began to cut through the music. It was the sound of splintering wood in the dead of night, as a phantom killer chiseled his way into the homes of sleeping families. He would ignore their money and their jewelry, and instead, he would pick up their own axe and use it to commit acts of unspeakable violence. This killer, who became known as the Axeman, was never caught. He was a ghost who terrorized a city, and then, after sending one of the most bizarre letters in the history of crime, a letter in which he claimed to be a demon from hell and made a strange promise involving jazz music, he vanished, leaving behind a legend that is forever woven into the dark musical soul of New Orleans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. All right, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you have certainly come to the right place. To truly understand this story, you have to imagine New Orleans in the early 20th century. This was a city that lived by its own rules. A bustling, humid port city on the Mississippi River, it was a melting pot of cultures: French, Spanish, African, Creole, and a large, growing community of Italian immigrants, mostly from Sicily. It was a place of deep Catholic faith, but also a place where the traditions of voodoo were practiced openly in the city's shadowy back alleys. It was a city of contradictions, where gaslit cobblestone streets met the electric glow of raucous dance halls from which a new revolutionary sound called jazz music spilled out into the night. It was into this vibrant, chaotic, and superstitious world that the Axeman came. Our story begins on the morning of May 23rd, 1918. Two brothers, Jake and Andrew Maggio, walked to the small grocery store and saloon they owned with their other brother, Joseph, and his wife, Catherine. The store was located on the ground floor of a two-story building, with Joseph and Catherine's apartment directly above. When they arrived, they found the front door was locked, which was unusual. After getting no answer, they went around to the back and found a disturbing sight. The bottom panel of the back door had been chiseled out, creating a crude opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. A deep sense of dread washed over them. They managed to get inside and called out for their brother and his wife, but were met with a dead, oppressive silence. They climbed the stairs to the apartment, and the first thing they saw was their sister-in-law, Catherine, lying in a heap on the floor. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. In a state of shock and horror, they stumbled into the bedroom. There, they found their brother, Joseph, lying in his bed, his head and face having been brutally crushed by a massive, powerful blow. The sheets were soaked in blood. The police were called, and the scene they found was one of both savage violence and strange, meticulous detail. In the bathroom, they found a bloody axe, the kind used for splitting wood, which belonged to the Maggios themselves. It had been left in the bathtub as if to wash away the evidence. On the floor of the bedroom, they found a straight razor, which they determined had been used to cut Catherine's throat. Bizarrely, the razor belonged to Joseph's brother, Andrew, who worked as a barber and had left it at the apartment a few days earlier to have Joseph sharpen it for him. The killer had found it and used it, but the most confusing part of the crime scene was that nothing of value had been taken. Money was left in the cash register downstairs. Jewelry in the apartment was untouched. This was not a robbery. This was something else. This was a crime of pure, unadulterated rage. The police investigation was chaotic from the start. They initially suspected Andrew Maggio, the owner of the razor, but he had a solid alibi. They had no witnesses and no fingerprints. The only real clue was a cryptic message found faintly chalked on the sidewalk a few doors down. It read, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." This was a reference to a previous unsolved murder of a man named Tony Sciambra, but the police couldn't make a definitive link. The case went cold, a brutal but seemingly isolated incident. But then, 1 month later, the Axeman struck again. On June 27th, a baker named John Zanka was making his morning deliveries when he noticed that the back door of the grocery store, owned by a man named Louis Basumer, had its lower panel chiseled out. It was the exact same method of entry as the Maggio murder. Zonka alerted the police, who entered the apartment to find a gruesome scene. Louis Basumer and his mistress, a woman named Harriet Lowe, were in their bed, both having suffered horrific head injuries from a hatchet that, once again, belonged to the victims and had been left at the scene. Miraculously, both Basumer and Lowe were still alive. They were rushed to the hospital. As police investigated, they once again found that no money had been taken. This was not a robbery. This was a pattern. A serial killer was at large in New Orleans. A killer who seemed to specifically target Italian grocers, who used a chisel to silently enter their homes, and who used their own axes to attack them as they slept. The case took a bizarre turn at the hospital. Harriet Lowe, before lapsing into a coma, reportedly told police that she thought the attacker was a young, dark-skinned man, but her description was vague. A few days later, she changed her story completely and accused Louis Basumer, the man lying injured in the bed next to her, of being a German spy and of having attacked her. The police, desperate for a suspect, arrested Basumer. But Lowe's story kept changing, and with no other evidence, Basumer was eventually released. Harriet Lowe died a few days later, and the truth of what she saw died with her. The city of New Orleans was now gripped by fear. The Italian-American community in particular was terrified. They were being targeted, but they didn't know why. Many of them were recent immigrants who were already distrustful of the police, and they began to take matters into their own hands, arming themselves and forming vigilante groups to patrol their neighborhoods at night. The Axeman, however, remained silent for the rest of the summer. The city began to breathe a collective sigh of relief, hoping the nightmare was over. It wasn't. On March 10th, 1919, the killer returned with a vengeance, committing his most brutal and heartbreaking crime yet. The target was